Hey, it's Michael, and welcome to another podcast episode. Before I get into today's episode, we wanted to make an offer to you. If you go to firmsconsulting.com, you will see a pop-up or you will see a place to add in your email address, or you can register on the Firms Consulting website. If you register onto that website, you get put into an exclusive list. And what you get in that exclusive list is samples of the content we have available to FC insiders. So, that said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Strategy Skills podcast. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about how nations develop using technology and the roles that technology companies play in a nation's development. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to discuss Samsung. And I have a guest today, Geoffrey Cain, who is the author of Samsung Rising, a new book. It's actually one of the best books I've read that explains how Samsung became the corporate giant it is today, where it contributes something like, I think, 15 to 20% of South Korea's total exports, which is a significant number. So the interesting thing about the discussion I'll have with Geoffrey is when you talk about Samsung and we talk about the Asian tech companies, we tend to forget just how important and how good they were at marketing. We tend to focus on the technology side of it, and we kind of give Apple and American companies a lot of credit for their marketing skills. But Samsung was very good at marketing, and there are many examples in the book of where they were very strategic and very tactical at times to get their message out. But the part I liked the most about the discussion with Geoffrey was how he explained how a country develops by using these tech companies as catalysts. So we start off discussing Samsung, but you'll see as the discussion goes on, it becomes a discussion about country economics. And if you like the discussion, I enjoyed Geoffrey's book, Samsung Rising. I believe it's now available for sale. It's a good book. It's a good book because it reminds me of those books that were written about banks just after the financial crisis, whereby they documented how banks had developed, the decisions they made, and how those decisions had contributed to either the success or the failure of a bank. And the interesting thing about Geoffrey is that if you follow the discussion, we realize that the things that made Samsung successful in the past are the things that now holding them back. And we have a discussion about how companies need to adjust to that. And the final thing we look at is that even though Samsung sees itself as an insurgent to Apple, the incumbent, Samsung has to adjust and change because today they are the incumbent against Chinese insurgents. And the question becomes how they can do that. So it's a very good podcast where we talk about company strategy, country strategy, technology strategy, disruption strategy, and how all of this comes together to dictate how a country sets its strategy for a certain sector with the help of different players. So I hope you enjoyed, and with that, let's start the discussion. Let's hope we get lucky on the third attempt.
Yes, how's this?
Oh, much better.
Okay, perfect, yeah.
So I read the book. I enjoyed the book at a personal level, which is always a good sign.
Thank you.
So I have a lot of questions, but not questions about things I want to explore that you raised. And I think what's nice about the book is that a lot of people talk about Silicon Valley, but nobody's ever written anything about the Asian tech companies before.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons I wrote it. That's a good point because I was, there reporting in Korea, and I just found it so fascinating that there were these major technology giants. There was Samsung, Sony,
yes.
Other big, Foxconn, and then it's just like there's just not much information out there about them.
Yeah, exactly, and the interesting thing is they're not run like a Silicon Valley company at all. When I read the book, it's like one of the most rigid corporate entities I've ever heard about.
Yeah. Well, I thought that it was kind of like HBO's Succession. Have you ever seen that on HBO now?
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah.
When I was writing it, that was sort of that was the feeling that I was getting. I felt like I was watching an episode or a season of Succession with all these shareholder battles and the dynasty and royal succession and all this.
So when you were writing the book, one thing I'm very interested about is how you wrote the book. For example, did you start writing the book knowing that you're going to write about Samsung, or did this come out of a series of articles and series of interviews that led you to something interesting?
So actually, it came out of a little bit of both. So I never really anticipated that I was going to write about Samsung in particular. So I was covering the whole Silicon Valley tech scene for a while. I was writing about Apple versus Samsung, writing about Google. I was writing about these big emerging tech giants about 10 years ago. And I got an invitation to Korea for the Fast Company magazine. We were going to do a big story on Samsung, a cover story. And the story was going to be about, this tech giant that's gobbling up all the competitors, and how this was just as they were starting to, release their first smartphones and go to war with Apple. It was before Steve Jobs sued them. And we knew that something big was going to happen, because we had a feeling that this, there was this sudden new player that nobody had really heard of that was suddenly putting up a fight against Apple and making inroads against Google, and just suddenly kind of cementing itself in the Silicon Valley world. So, went there. I went there, toured for 2 days, interviewed about 24 top executives. These were kind of executive vice president level people, and I got fascinated with Samsung in particular because it was just so opaque, and it was so big, and it was everywhere. And I couldn't really figure out the true story of this company. I mean, I had this nagging feeling that there was this giant sitting in the room, and nobody had really taken a look and thought, like, who are these people and what do they stand for? How do they compete? How do they do strategy? How do they make products?
Yeah.
So originally, I knew that I wanted to write a book about Korea, and as a journalist, we tend to write a lot about North Korea in particular, with the crazy dictator Kim Jong-un and missile launches and all the concentration camps and starving children and just terrible human rights abuses. But I noticed that nobody had really been writing about South Korea, the success story. Nobody had really written about how this major, this small country had become so major in such a short period of time. It used to be one of the poorest countries in the world. It was behind Sudan in 1960. Yeah, GDP smaller than Sudan.
Yeah, and I've read that it was impoverished after the war.
Yeah, completely impoverished, and even before the war, it was already in poverty. So it was just, so if you visit Seoul today or visit anywhere in Korea, you walk around and you're in this, I think Time Magazine a while back called it the most wired nation in the world. And you get off the plane there and just everything is super efficient. And, it actually reminds me quite a bit of, maybe going to, like Berlin or kind of like a efficient Scandinavian or German town. But then, I'm looking at Korea and looking at the history and thinking, come on, like there's no way this country could have emerged so quickly and become such a success story that easily. There was definitely something behind this, and one of the big stories behind it was Samsung. So Samsung was my way in to tell a story about this country of Korea, not just a company itself, but how this company, Samsung, was tied to the success of the nation, and how they built, Korea into something big, and how that was a part of their mission. They didn't just want to make microwaves and make the latest phone and make make ships and make chips and all these different products. What they wanted to do was build Korea with them. They wanted to contribute to this grand nation building project. And, I think even today you see that quite a bit. Like Samsung is just so, it's just so massive.
Yes.
I mean, you can live your entire life cradle to the grave on Samsung. You could literally just, be born in a Samsung hospital in Korea. You could go to a Samsung school and get a Samsung scholarship, and you grow up and go to the Samsung University and study at the Samsung library, and then get a job at Samsung Life Insurance, and you can use a Samsung credit card, and you can watch TV on your Samsung TV, and it'll be like a Samsung funded soap opera. They've done some production too, and get in your Samsung Renault car. You can use your Samsung smartphone, your PC. It's just literally. You could literally die, and there's a Samsung morgue, and then there's a cemetery that Samsung consults on. You can literally just live your entire life on Samsung and just become, they call it a Samsung man. And you've sworn allegiance to this company, and your job is to build the nation with the company too.
And you can maybe marry a Samsung employee as well.
Yeah. So you can join Samsung. It used to be that there was an expectation of lifetime employment. If you were in Korea and you joined young, you would retire when you were 50 or maybe 60, depending on what rank you got to. And then it's very old school. It would be almost like you get the company watch. You retire and they send you off, and you're a part of the Samsung Alumni Association, and you still get together with your old friends and drink soju, which is a Korean a vodka-like liquor that they like to drink. But I just found it fascinating. I guess To use maybe a North American equivalent, it would be as if, I guess, are you calling from Canada right now?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so the American equivalent would be, so yes, people often do point out to me, what about America with the too big to fail, the banks in the 2008 crisis, and
But it's
what
not the
about
same,
Apple,
right?
these major companies? I mean, they're massive, and they're so massive that it's almost like they rival governments in their size and wealth and power. But I think that this still doesn't exist in America on the scale that it exists in Korea. So the closest thing to imagine would be that Steve Jobs, back when he was alive, he ran Apple, and Apple was so big that Americans call their country the United States of Apple.
Yeah.
But really, just Apple is everywhere in your life, and there's no, like, you come home and you have you have like an Apple microwave and Apple, you live in an Apple apartment, and you've pretty much sworn your allegiance to Apple as a lifetime employee. But then on top of that, imagine if Steve Jobs were convicted twice of, bribing the president. And then also he was convicted of tax evasion later. And then, the first time President Bill Clinton gave him a pardon and said that he's just so important to the nation. And then the second time Barack Obama gave him a pardon and said that, once again, he is just so important to the nation, so he can't go to jail. Steve Jobs has to be running Apple for the sake of America and the future of America.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting. So when you wrote the book seems to be focused heavily on Samsung Mobile. Was that the intent from the beginning?
So actually, that was one of the hard parts, to be honest, of writing the book. The fact of the matter is that Samsung has more than 50 affiliates. A lot of them are publicly traded companies, and they make semiconductors. They've done shipping in the past. They made airline engines. They've made the displays that are used on a lot of devices, including on iPhones. Samsung pretty much makes, they control the whole supply chain, and they make everything that they would need to make a new smartphone.
Yes.
So this, I wanted to tell the story of some of these other units too, but as I was doing the research, well, first of all, the first problem was that, I simply can't write a 1,000-page book on Samsung, and nobody would buy that, and unfortunately, and like if I had a publisher that would allow me to do that, I would certainly try to write it. But ultimately, readers want something that, you open it, it has a clear narrative, you close it, and then you kind of come away with some lessons or some insight. But then the second problem I had, it was a huge challenge, writing about this Samsung empire. And the challenge was that there were simply so many different business units and so many people in this company. I mean, the conglomerate itself has more than 300,000 people. And this,
but 300,000 is massive.
Yeah, and this is the entire Samsung group. I mean, if you look at Samsung Electronics alone, which is one company within this giant corporate empire, they make up about 20% of South Korean exports. So one out of every 5 exports from Korea is a Samsung Electronics product of some kind. And that's not including Samsung Semiconductor or Samsung, Samsung Shipping or, Samsung Display or any of these other affiliates. It's just such a big company that ultimately you have to choose a strand that can carry through. And in the end, so I did decide to focus on mobile as the main story, because the fact of the matter is that within Samsung, mobile is seen as the crown jewel. Mobile is the most prestigious of the units, and mobile is where the big decisions happen. So that's where the top leaders, so the founding Lee family, which is the 3-generation dynasty that runs Samsung, they'll actually be there. They'll be more involved in trying to make big long-term decisions over where mobile should be going and, what it should be doing. And then also, so I don't have the latest numbers with me right now, but when I was researching this at one point, mobile made up around 60 to 80% of the group's revenues. And I think this was at the height of the Apple versus Samsung wars about 6-7 years ago. And just the fact that it's so big meant, and so profitable, meant that a lot of the other business units were basically making decisions based on the future demands of what mobile would need. So the semiconductor units, like if mobile puts in an order, for the latest semiconductor, then of course Samsung Semiconductor is going to be trying to make that, and Samsung Display was making OLEDs for a long time because both Apple and Samsung needed them. So really, mobile, like the front-facing businesses are really what defines the company. Maybe not always, but right now that's what's been defining them for the past 10 years.
and driving them, as you say. It's the front end that places orders in the back end. But let's talk about some of the insights. So when I was reading the book, I assumed three things. One is I'll learn a lot about South Korea, which I did. So the book really mirrors that very well and shows us how, the rise of Samsung propelled the rise of Korea and laid almost a blueprint for other large Korean conglomerates to follow. I learned a lot about Samsung, but the thing that surprised me was how aggressive Samsung is in marketing.
Yes.
I didn't think I would learn. The book is a lot about marketing, especially that part where you talk about how they got Ellen DeGeneres to mention Samsung and use a Samsung phone during the award ceremony.
Yes. And actually, when I was researching this, I was totally surprised by the amount of marketing and the aggression in the marketing that comes out. I actually, before I was writing this book, I didn't totally realize just the extent that Samsung had gone to do something like get a phone in the hands of Ellen DeGeneres. That's awesome. It was. I actually got kind of a chuckle out of it. It is, to be fair to Samsung, it is a success story.
You should just mention that briefly for the listeners so they understand the actual lengths that Samsung goes to.
Yes. So just to give a little backdrop first. So Samsung rose on the factory floor. It was a factory floor giant, and it was staffed mainly by engineers, people in research and development who were, looking for the latest patent, but ultimately people who were working hard on the factory floor. And so it had developed, like a lot of factory floor-based companies, it had developed a very conservative, military-like culture where, the top person gives the order and then everybody has to execute it. The top person, the Lee dynasty will lay down a vision for the long term, and then it's the job of the actual executives to execute that vision, to implement it, and to ensure that the chairman's vision is carried out. So this works really well when you're, when you're a poor country like Korea, maybe 40 years ago, and you're just trying to make your first forays into, say, making microwaves, cheap microwaves that, for example, GE was ordering, and they would just put a GE logo on it, and that was the original Samsung model. It was the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer. This is the military model works great for that because you can produce so many cheap products at high volume and with pretty low defect rates. I mean, if your workforce is disciplined, if they know what they're doing, if they're following orders, then they're going to be a component supplier, they're going to be an OEM. But the fact of the matter is that Korea had, over the years, Korea had gone from zero to hero, so to speak. It had gone from nothing through this manufacturing model, export-driven model, to one of the biggest technological powerhouses in the world. And of course, naturally that led Samsung to do battle with Sony, its first big competitor, which was from Japan. And I don't know how many listeners will remember the days when Sony, basically the Apple of the world, about 15 years ago. I mean, Sony made the Walkman. And you'd see all the cool kids walking around the campuses with their latest Walkman CD player. It made the Trinitron TV. It had acquired Columbia Pictures for a multi-billion-dollar deal in 1989. It also had its own. So back when they had the VHS tapes, it also had a thing called the Betamax, which was like the competitor to the VHS. It was like the high-quality version. And so basically, Sony controlled just a huge, in terms of the media and technology sector, just had its own ecosystem of all these products that were feeding into each other. Just like it had the TV, it also had the format, the Betamax. It also had the the content. It had like the Arnold Schwarzenegger films that Sony Pictures would get. Yeah, so it was just no chance of anybody taking on Sony. And of course, Samsung comes along, and Samsung wants to become like another Sony. It wants to release its own ecosystem of all these different TVs and components, and it wants to own the content. It tried to acquire DreamWorks a long time ago, back when Steven Spielberg was starting it. That failed. But the problem is that when you're a component maker and a manufacturer, that doesn't lead well to that world of Hollywood and the world of, how do you market a product, or how do you, it doesn't lead to the world of Times Square that well. How do you advertise something on a giant billboard? How do you reach the next generation? How do you reach the millennials? How do you get on social media? It naturally, this corporate culture of militarism naturally leads to this execution culture where, you're only putting out the next product without much thought to, what does that do for the user? What does that do for the consumer? I mean, it's just, I think that Samsung had a really bad habit for a long time of just releasing a new phone and then saying, oh, it has a super AMOLED display.
Yes,
yeah, it's just like, Yeah, and then of course, maybe that appeals to a nerd who's really into display technology, and it appeals to Samsung's own engineers. It's kind of like internal propaganda, internal public relations. But the average person out there is just sitting there thinking like, okay, so I can get an iPhone that has the whole experience. It has, it has the ecosystem, it has the software, it has, nice clean apps, a nice design, a nice user interface. It's virus free mostly, it's secure. Or I can get this Samsung phone that is essentially like, okay, they're telling me it has a super AMOLED display. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
And this was the problem that Samsung was having for a really long time. They simply, they could overtake their competitors through mass manufacturing, better hardware, but they couldn't really tell a story. They just had trouble telling people who they are and what they were all about. What what does
functional, very functional.
So, yeah, exactly. So what happened is that in 2010 and 2011, Steve Jobs was very upset with Samsung because Samsung was supplying the components to the iPhone, but then had dared to release its own smartphone called the Galaxy that had dared to compete head-on with Apple. And not only that, but a court did rule later in California that Samsung had ripped off a number of patents and awarded Apple damages. Samsung countersued and claimed that Apple had ripped off its own patents, but Samsung lost that. It didn't get any damages at all. So clearly, Apple was in the right, in terms of a lot of these claims brought against Samsung. But so the problem is that, if you're a Samsung executive and you look at the big picture, so you're releasing a phone that nobody really seems to get what the point is of it. It's just like a cheaper version of the iPhone without the ecosystem, the user experience. Apple's accusing you of copying them. Apple has this Steve Jobs cult, these followers who just love Steve Jobs. But then there's this final problem of, well, Apple just simply has the brand name. People recognize Apple and they know what they're all about. And that when you buy an Apple product, for the most part, it's exactly what it's exactly, you're getting what you're promised. It's exactly what it's going to be like. The build, the quality. It's going to be a good experience for most people. So what does Samsung do? So Samsung made this decision to hire a marketer named Todd Pendleton, who I had spent some time with, and I spent some time with his former team. They've all left Samsung now, but I spent many hours getting coffee with them and interviewing them, getting their stories. And Todd Pendleton was a former Nike marketer, and you have to imagine that for a company like Samsung to hire somebody like this, who he led the LeBron James deal with Nike, he led the Kobe Bryant deal with Nike. This is really unusual for a company like Samsung, and this signaled that their top executives had actually realized that they had a serious marketing and brand problem. That that they've finally come to terms with this idea that we know now that Apple's just going to beat us, and if we don't tell a story, then it doesn't matter what phone we put out. So Todd Pendleton and his team, they got to work pretty quickly. This was in 2011, and this was the office that was essentially, I would call it the vanguard, or like kind of the front lines in the Apple versus Samsung wars. Their job was to find a way to reverse the narrative against Apple, and to try to turn the claims of Steve Jobs on its head. So how do they do that? So one of the big ideas that they drew on was Coke versus Pepsi.
Yeah, and that's a good chapter. I remember reading that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So Coke versus Pepsi, it's one of the classic MBA case studies. I think every business student probably has to read some kind of Harvard business case study on this war from the 1970s and 1980s. It was back when Coke was the dominant drink, and it was a drink that had basically branded, the holiday of Christmas. It was associated with Santa Claus and, the color red. And it had been so successful in its branding and marketing campaigns over the years that it had, essentially become associated with America itself. Coke is America in the same way, Apple is almost like, branded in this super efficient way where it's like Apple is, like kind of like the good guys, the good guys of Silicon Valley. So Pepsi came along, and until this point, there were so many different cola drinks that would enter and exit the market really quickly, but nobody could ever really stand up against Coke. And Pepsi, back in the day, back before Pepsi was big, it was kind of seen as the cool young person's drink. Like you would see high schoolers drinking it, or like the college campuses, you'd see students kind of hanging around having their Pepsi. They saw it as a bit of a rebellious cola drink back in the 60s. But then Pepsi got this idea, like they were still in the shadow of Coke. They still weren't that, big. And their marketers got this idea. What if we just simply went head on with Coke and just basically, like, instead of trying to beat Coke, you don't go head on. You don't play a game of chicken where two cars are racing against each other and then you crash and die. That would be terrible. I mean, you could kill your own brand if you went up against a major giant like that. But what if we did something else? What if we just went head to head with Coke in a way that makes them go crazy with our advertising, and then they simply lose their minds and do something really stupid that ruins their consumer loyalty and their market share and their sales and all this.
Which is what they did, right?
and that's what they did. So they set up a special, it was called the Pepsi Challenge, and it was a series of commercials. They would invite people, at shopping malls and beaches and all these places, just random passerbys, and they'd say, you're going to do a blind taste test, and we won't tell you which drink is which. And they would do so they would put on the blindfold, they would drink like a Coke or a Pepsi, and then they would ask which one they like better. And the majority of them said Pepsi. Mm-hmm. And this was an enormously successful campaign because basically what it did is it elevated Pepsi to become the only name that was said in the same breath as Coke. Yeah, like, do you like Coke or do you like Pepsi? Before that, it wasn't like that at all.
Yeah.
So this caused Coke to lose its mind, and Coke just, they started to question their own recipe, and the recipe was the sacrosanct thing of Coke. Like, everybody was loyal to that Coke recipe that's been a national secret for, like the past 100 years or something. And they decided to change, they actually changed the recipe for a while, and they created a new drink, and it was called New Coke.
Yes.
What they've done is that they had abandoned their own loyalists, consumers, the people who like the old Coke better. So it was just this uproar, and they lost their market share, and in the end they had to go back to the old Coke. And even though Coke did recover in the end, that was the victory for Pepsi, that it was now the two-horse race. It was Coke versus Pepsi always, and it was never just Coke dominating everybody.
But I just want to point out something here. I mean, something you say for the audience is, Pepsi went from running almost a guerrilla campaign to being seen as the accepted competitor to Coke.
Yes, exactly. They went from running a guerrilla campaign that was highly controversial and very risky. In hindsight, it's always easy to say, yeah, of course it would be successful. But at the time, it was a very risky guerrilla marketing campaign because if you attack your competitor head on, you might just be giving them free advertising. You might actually look like you're just being petty, and you might look like a weakling, like you've got something to prove. You're trying a little too hard.
Yes.
Stand up to the big guy in the room. But then there's also the other risk of, what if you're filming these commercials and then more people just choose Coke? If that would be a disaster. That you would just get your butt kicked. That just looks so terrible if you set up this whole thing and then everybody just rejected you and said Coke is actually better. That would be a business destroying ad campaign.
But I think they understood American culture well. Americans like a comeback story.
Yeah, they do. And I think that Americans, especially when it comes to marketing campaigns, they like comeback stories, and they like the small guy. They like the underdog.
They love the small guy, the underdog.
Yeah, the underdog. They like the guy who's standing up to the the powerful guy in the room.
That explains the appeal of Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that is the story of Silicon Valley. I know today it's very fashionable to hate, Jeff Bezos and all these guys. But if you go back to, 20, 30, 40 years ago, Silicon Valley was it was the rebellion culture. It was the counterculture. It was, these were essentially hippies from the late 60s and 70s who had taken on to technology and thought that they could upend the system with their own technologies. They could upend IBM, and they could get rid of Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor, who were associated with the military-industrial complex of the Cold War. These were the companies that these startups truly hated, and people cheered them on because they were young rebels, and they were almost like rebels without a cause. They didn't really care if they went out of business. They were willing to take risks and do whatever they could over and over and over again to get to that one big success that would change the way we use our technology.
Yeah, but that's a good point. I think people need to remember that as they read the book and as they listen to the podcast. It's about understanding where where society is, where the pulse is at the moment. I think Pepsi understood that at the time. But let's continue with the story of how Samsung marketing learned from this.
Yes, yes. So actually, what you just said, I think that was a very good point, Michael, about understanding where the pulse is. And the Samsung marketers, who were based out of Richardson, Texas, it's a little suburb nearby Dallas, they had been doing this market research, and they had found this interesting trend that was developing. So the pulse was that people were getting kind of tired of Apple and Steve Jobs.
Yes.
They were just getting. I mean, there was a huge segment of the market out there of potential consumers who maybe had been dabbling in smartphones, who took a liking to Android, which was run by Google and still is, and who didn't really want to get an iPhone because to be frank, they just thought it was douchey. They just thought it was like there are all these iPhone maniacs out there who they think they're really cool and creative. But really, all they're doing is just paying a lot of money for a smartphone that they're paying too much. They don't really need to pay this much, and they're just paying to get branded. It's like they're putting an Apple tattoo on the back of their neck or something, and running around and saying like, "Look at me, I'm so like cool and creative, and I'm like I run a really hip coffee shop, and I'm just like so much cooler than all of you because I've got the latest Apple phone." And these are the guys who would stand out in line at the Apple stores, for like 9 hours the previous night for the next big device that's being released. But I remember those days. I think that doesn't exist anymore. But I remember even I was kind of feeling that way.
Yeah.
So I'm a millennial. I'm from the millennial generation, and I just remember when the first iPhone came out, thinking like, okay, cool, yeah, see, so Apple's making a comeback. But then 3-4 years in, it was just like, okay, like enough Apple now. Can we please do something new? In this, just something new out there. It doesn't have to be a phone, but just no more Steve Jobs, please. No more Tim Cook. So the Samsung executives, led by Todd Pendleton, saw this opening. They saw that the pulse was changing, and they saw that there was this tribe of Android users. And these were people who would go on web forums and talk about their Android phones and how they can tinker with Android. They also saw that Android was much more customizable than the iPhone, than the iOS. It was much more versatile. You could use it. I mean, if you're in a creative field, Android could easily be way more useful than an iPhone, which is more like a mass-produced device. And so they decided, all these Android people, they were basically a tribe, but they were looking for a leader. They didn't really have anybody who had stood up yet and said, we're Team Android and we're against Apple. We don't like Apple.
I just want to stop you for a second, Jeff. This is very interesting. So what you're saying is, and I want to make sure the audience understands this, okay?
Yes.
Because I picked it up from the book, but you're articulating it very well. Because when people think of Android, they think of it as a unified operating system. But what you're saying is that there's a lot of Android players, but there's no one. Well, until Samsung came along, there was no one dominant Android player.
Yes, and I guess the equivalent would be, so back in the days when Windows was becoming the dominant operating system. I mean, I remember the days when I was a kid in the 90s, Windows 95 came out, and it was just a gold rush to get the new operating system. And of course, so there's a great OS, great software, but who leads the hardware?
Yes.
And for a while, that became IBM. IBM was the biggest PC maker, and it was
ThinkPads. I remember those things.
Yeah. So it was IBM and Microsoft versus Apple for a long time.
Yeah.
And this is essentially a similar thing happening in the smartphone world. So there's Apple. There's this great Android software, and it was, I used Android phones for a long time too, and I also used iPhones, and I came to like the Android software better because it was just so much more customizable, and I could use it for I could back in the day. I could record with it easily. It was hard to record with iPhones. I use that for my work a lot. And, I was just thinking, like, come on, like this whole iPhone thing, it has to be overrated. I mean, yeah, they are good phones, but like, I'm just really skeptical that the iPhone is the only one out there that, that we have to use in the year 2012. The only phone that, makes a difference in the world. So, so it was, there was this Android software. And, it was great software, but there wasn't really a hardware maker or an actual, product in front of you that would be the Android phone. Google wasn't really making phones that much. I don't remember when they made their first phone, but I mean, it was like you could choose an LG, you could choose a Motorola, which was owned by Google for a little while. You could choose the BlackBerry phone. You could choose the HTC.
Yes.
These are all names that I think that they've pretty much been forgotten today. I think that back then you had to choose from this wide catalog of hardware makers, but they were all making kind of junky hardware that nobody really cared about. And the idea of the Samsung executives in Texas was, well, why don't we just get rid of all these guys, just kind of wipe them clean and turn this into a two-horse race? And there are two camps. Either you're the Samsung guy with your Android phone, usually, or you're the Apple guy with your iPhone. And we're going to turn this into a Coke versus Pepsi war for the smart world, for the smartphone world.
So basically, they made it easy for consumers. Rather than trying to debate which phone is the best fit for Android, they gave consumers less choice.
Yes, they gave consumers less choice, and that's the irony of it. They put a Samsung phone in front of them, and they said, this has, in most cases, it has better hardware than the latest Apple. I mean, they never said Apple directly, but they would say our competitor. They would say our competitor. They don't have 4G yet. They're still on 3G. This is a 4G phone. It's a lot faster. We have a better display. Here's our display technology. We have better processor that we made. And then they would go to the operating system and say, this is just a much more customizable phone that you can use for just about anything. I mean, we have more features. We have more. More apps. It's a freer ecosystem. More people are allowed to upload apps. It's something that, like, if you don't want to buy the latest iPhone, just take a look at Samsung. And so the way they did this, it was a very clever marketing campaign. So it was called The Next Big Thing Is Here, and it was filmed. There was an ad agency called 72 and Sunny that was hired to work on this. They're really probably one of the best ad agencies in the business a couple of years ago. I mean, for a while, they were just on fire.
And just so, do you know if the guy from Nike who came over to run marketing, is he the one who brought in this ad agency?
Yeah, he did. He brought in 72 and Sunny. He also brought in a lot of his NBA contacts, old Nike contacts. He was able to bring in, LeBron and these guys to do commercials. And, he was able to bring in Jay-Z. I mean, he was really big on the obviously coming from Nike, big on the celebrity deals, celebrity endorsements, and trying to get celebrities to really like, their Samsung phones instead of just paying them a bunch of money to use it. So the Next Big Thing campaign, it was a commercial ad campaign. It aired on social media. It was on the NBA Finals.
Yes,
and it won a lot of awards. I don't remember which awards right now, but it was one of the classic marketing campaigns of the era. And what happened was that it would show, it would open with an Apple store, presumably an Apple store, and it would show, all these kind of millennials, kind of 20s and 30s, hipster kids standing around in this giant line that goes out the door and around the corner. And, it's they're saying it's 16 hours to go until the next big iThing is released, and I can't wait for this. I'm so hyped. I'm so amped. And, all right, 15 more hours, 14 more hours, and they're just standing around, talking about mindless things. And, one of them would say, the headphone jack is going to go on the bottom. And you're just like, okay, so, and then one of them says, something like, I heard the adapter is all digital. And then he's like, what does that even mean? I don't even know. So they're just trolling and making fun of these hardcore Apple geeks, Steve Jobs geeks. And then
it's a little bit of like what Apple did to Microsoft in those ad campaigns a few years ago.
Actually, it was. There was a similar campaign in the early 2000s. I think it was called "I'm a Mac, I'm a PC."
Yes, I remember that. Very effective.
It was very effective, and I remember there was a time back then when the Mac was gaining momentum, and with that ad campaign, they were able to reverse it, and I mean, it was very effective, just trolling their rival and just making the rival look like they're not really that cool. They're not as awesome as they think they are, right? I mean, and they showed the PC guy as this kind of stodgy, kind of stuffy. I'd have to go back and look at it, but it was very funny.
Well, what they did is they turned technical superiority into almost a handicap. If you talk about how technically superior, you're almost a geek, and it's a bad thing.
Yes.
And they did it very well. I mean, you don't know they're doing it, but they're making you dislike someone even though they're actually good at something.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess this campaign with Samsung, that's a good way of putting it. I think that it was almost, it was almost, so it was a very similar strategy. I mean, it was a very similar way of doing things because it was just so, it was almost like these Apple geeks were, they were talking about technical advances in the iPhone, but a lot of times they didn't know what they were talking about, or it was just not significant. I mean, it was a minor upgrade.
As Clayton Christensen says in The Innovator's Dilemma,
uh-huh.
At a certain time, you overshoot the needs of the market. So every new iteration of a technology means nothing to the market.
Yes, yes. And that is, you're right, The Innovator's Dilemma. That was one of the big issues in there. I remember that. Such a classic book. And actually, that book, when I was writing this book, I went back a bit, and I was reading and rehashing, that old book just because it was such a, so influential on this whole technology world we live in. But that is one of the dilemmas, right? That there's a tendency to overestimate what the market wants. I think that if you're in technology and you're an innovator and you want to get out the next big thing, you've always got to be asking yourself, well, does the average guy who uses a smartphone, does he really care that this has, a 9 ampemeter battery life versus an 8? And, it's easy to get into that, that mindset when you're there at the table with all the creative, designers and engineers around the table. There's always going to be a tendency to overshoot or to overdo the capabilities to show your stuff, to show how cool you are, how awesome you are. But sometimes people just want a phone that works. And actually, I just got off before I was talking to you, I actually had a really interesting call with an advertising executive who works with a lot of these smartphone firms, and it's one of the big firms up in the Pacific Northwest. And he was telling me about how they're having this problem now with 5G. That there was a lot of hype around 5G, and people were saying, like, we got to get out the next 5G phones. We have to impress the consumers with this new capability. They can download a movie in a second, or they all these crazy things, I'm so me as I use my smartphone a lot, and I just remember hearing about the first 5G phones, and then just kind of wondering, like, well, I don't need to download a movie in a second. I can stream. I can stream on Spotify, and the sound quality. I'm also a sound nerd. I'm a musician, and even then, the sound quality is fine. I don't really need a 5G that's going to be able to send me higher quality audio on my phone. I would rather turn to a real stereo for something like that. I think that this is a problem that's coming up over and over again, especially in strategy and marketing right now, because we're on the verge of all these different these different breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and 5G and facial recognition, voice recognition. Biotechnology even. I mean, there's so much that we're just on the verge. It's almost like a pregnant woman about to pop the baby out. And it's going to come in this decade. But, I mean, the big question is, what
does it mean for us?
Yeah, what's the significance? What is the significance? I'm sure AI will certainly have a lot of significance. I think that'll be an easy sell for a lot of people once they see how convenient it makes their life. But something like 5G or something like the latest non-memory semiconductor, which is going to get big soon. The average person just like, my phone works fine, and my friend, he likes his phone, and my landlord seems to like his iPhone, and why buy a new phone for $1,000 or more when the old ones have matured so well? They just work great.
Yeah, exactly. But let's get back to the marketing story.
Oh yes. Sorry to diverge there.
No, it's all interesting. It's all interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so this marketing campaign at Samsung was extremely controversial internally after the first commercials aired. So the problem, and this is what the executives started to realize as they got further into this campaign, the problem was that Samsung was not just competing with Apple, but it was also a supplier to Apple. Yes. And Samsung executives in the semiconductor field or the display business unit would call up the executives in the smartphone unit and the marketing unit and just yell at them and scream and say, what are you doing? Like, you're attacking our partner head on. You're making a phone, but remember that we're actually making the displays for the latest iPhone.
So and competition, right?
Sorry, what was that?
There's a competition because you have different There's almost a conflict of interest.
Huge conflicts of interest there, and this is one of the big dilemmas that arises from Samsung's business model, and that business model is to compete with your partners, to supply them parts, but then to build products that can beat them out at the same time.
Yes.
It's a smart model because it makes you indispensable. I mean, you really do have a powerful position in the industry with this model if you can make a lot of components. But then the downside is, well, you can't really attack your partners head on. You're going to have you're going to have a lot of trouble competing. You can't really set up a good marketing strategy that will position Samsung as the best maker of a phone or a TV, because you don't want to anger Sony, or you don't want to anger Apple or some other big company.
There's another important insight that you're bringing out here, is that a lot of times when you look at marketing decisions or strategy decisions, we don't think about how internal conflicts of interest drive that. We always think it's about what does the consumer want, but in this case, we can see a clear example where a conflict of interest is driving a marketing decision.
Yes, and that is one of the big lessons, I think, from Samsung, and it's a lesson that you'll find in any major multinational corporation, I think anywhere in the world, New York, Silicon Valley, the big companies. So, we tend to think of, when we think of marketing and strategy, I think that there's a bias to look at Apple or Facebook, but these are extremely, relatively specialized organizations that work in very specific spheres. Let's say if you were to look at GE or IBM or any old tech titan from the past century that's not like a Silicon Valley giant, these are still massive companies. But I think they're overlooked in a lot of marketing because they're just like Samsung. They supply their competitors, and Honeywell, which is a giant from the 1950s and 60s, still massive. I mean, they'll probably be supplying some kind of hardware semiconductor component to the refrigerators made by its competitors. But then Honeywell also makes refrigerators, so they can't really release a marketing campaign that goes at their competitors' refrigerators. I mean, that's just something to keep in mind. And I think that a lot of people don't realize this until after they're deep into the campaign, what conflicts of interest they actually do have, and sometimes they have to pull back.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Imagine going out and telling your marketing team you've done a wonderful job. Everyone's talking about Samsung. Everyone's happy with the campaign. We're seeing an increase in sales, but we've got to pull back because it's upsetting the division that's selling to Apple.
Yes, and I mean, I can't even imagine just how these marketers felt. I talked to them, and they told me how they felt, but just I couldn't imagine just the amount of frustration and the anger and the resentment that was building up in there, because they had done such an incredible job with this marketing campaign. It was a Super Bowl campaign. It was getting a ton of attention in the media. I mean, it was on social media. It had turned Samsung into the only name mentioned in the same breath as Apple. It was, are you going to get an iPhone? Or are you going to get a Samsung? One or the other. Yes. Nobody ever asks you if you're going to get an LG. And that's what these marketers led by Todd Pendleton had achieved. And the height of their success, actually, which you had mentioned earlier, was the Oscar selfie. They wanted to get these...
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that it had been orchestrated. I just thought she had done it until I read the book. I didn't know it was all planned with so much work.
Yeah. But that was the brilliance of it. I mean, it was a very brief shot, but that one shot it was the most retweeted shot in all of Twitter's history, and it still is the most retweeted tweet ever. So so that shot, and just to remind our listeners, so that was in 2014 at the Oscars. When Ellen DeGeneres, she had her Galaxy Note, I think it was a Galaxy Note 3, and she wanted to do this last-minute selfie. It was partially written into the script, but it was kind of left out just to make it kind of improvise and make it, they didn't want this to be too planned and overdone like a regular marketing stunt, but they wanted it to be natural and they wanted it to have flow. So Ellen DeGeneres got this idea that she wanted to shoot a selfie and try to break Twitter. She thought we could make history and see how many retweets we can get on this thing. So during the show, she approached Meryl Streep and then Brad Pitt and a few others and managed to get them in the audience all around to stand up, to get all around into this one selfie shot that she took, and then she put it up. And it was a Samsung stunt. So Samsung marketers were present at the Oscar the rehearsals, and they had actually seen Ellen using her iPhone. She was an iPhone user. And since they had this sponsorship, they decided that they were going to try to give her a Galaxy Note and see how she liked it. Ironically, they had to teach her how to use it because she wasn't a Samsung user. But they wanted people to notice the fact that she was using a Samsung, and they thought that would be it would be a good stunt. Like it would kind of put Samsung into that realm with Apple, where they're able to get celebrities just to use their phone without having to constantly badger them about, like with these celebrity deals and stuff. So.
But the thing is that nobody knew that was a stunt, because I went back and read the clippings from that selfie, but no reporter realized it was a marketing stunt at the time.
Yeah, I think that very few people realized. So there were some people. I was following Twitter when this happened because I was researching the book, and there were some people who pointed out that when she went backstage, suddenly she was tweeting from her iPhone because it said, tweeted from iPhone on the tweet. And then that's how some people noticed. They said, okay, this must have been some kind of stunt, because why else would she pull out a Samsung Note? Why would she pull that out and then just go back to an iPhone backstage?
Well, I think Ellen would have told us she has one phone for her personal life and one for her business life.
Yeah. I think she might have said that at some point, but so it didn't really come out until later. So Todd Pendleton did later on talk more about how that was it was partially staged, but how I think that the marketers the way they described their philosophy to me was that these kinds of things are like a lightning strike, that you can never predict when or where it'll happen, but you can set up the circumstances to try to take advantage of when it will happen. And when that lightning does strike, you'll be ringing in the bonanza. And it's risky marketing because, not everybody can pull this off, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, tons of resources into something that might not actually happen. I mean, Samsung, I think it had a $20 million estimated sponsorship for 5 years or something with the Oscars.
That may be the world's most expensive selfie.
Yeah, it's the world's most expensive selfie, and it worked for them. It's it's something that it's an example of the campaign and how they were trying to transform themselves into more of a cultural company, like more like a Nike with the Just Do It. Like they're trying to transform themselves into a company that's not just making hardware, but they're actually a part of these cultural moments, and they're a part of American, society and American culture.
They want you to have an emotional response to Samsung.
Sorry, what was that?
They want you to have an emotional response to Samsung.
Yes, and that's exactly where the genius of this particular campaign was. It was, it really was building the emotional connection to the user, and I think that really is one of the hardest parts of marketing or strategy, because in the strategy world, I think that people tend to be dominated these days by data and analyzing the graph. Where is this market likely going to go? Is there a risk? Is there a competitor that's going to come in who we can't see right now? But it's easy to get the emotional side and the creative side lost in all that debate. I was actually just reading the book by Bob Iger, the former CEO of Disney, and he actually talks a bit about that too. How they at Disney, when he first arrived, he had to disband the main corporate strategy office. It was a really old famous office at Disney that micromanaged all these decisions across this massive company that does a lot like kind of like Samsung. He found that it was just impeding just way too much on the emotional appeal and the creative appeal, and this office was essentially turning Disney into this faceless corporation that's not very likable. That the days of Mickey Mouse and the childhood charm had been lost because this office was just so meddlesome in the creative decisions of the actual studio directors. And I think that Samsung and a lot of companies have had very similar problems where if you're in engineering, if you're in technology, how do you make that leap from just making a set of parts that come together into a phone, turning it into something that is an experience in itself, that you pick up your phone and you're transported to a world, and that world can be a website somewhere or a video, or you're transported to maybe a virtual reality game, or it's not just about it's the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That's the lesson here, I think.
Yes, I know. I think what you're saying is very good, because if you look at the evolution of Samsung, they go through an evolution pattern all companies go through. At the beginning, they don't have a strong enough brand, so they have to, white label their products. At a certain point, they realize that they have to control their destiny, so they start to brand themselves. And because they don't have a big brand name, they have to compete at the low end of the market. But you can't compete there forever. So at some point, you've got to get into America's consciousness. And that's where they are now. Yes, and it's all because of this marketing campaign, because no one talks about, we all talk about the technology, but no one's going to talk about the technology if the marketing campaign didn't make us want to even think about Samsung.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think you just summed it up exactly how it's happened. It's it's not just about putting the product in front of the consumer, but it's about getting into their imagination. And if you look at every major successful company in, maybe, I don't know if this is just America, but maybe just around the world, when it comes to being a success, you really have to make people imagine things. You have to spark the imagination. You have to spark the creativity or the curiosity or kind of the sense of excitement. Like, if I get this new smartphone, what is it going to bring for me? Like, in a positive way. Like, it's exciting. Like, it's sitting here, it's in the wrapper, I'm opening it up, and I just can't wait to turn this on and just see what this is all about, because I feel like I'm looking at a minor work of art here. Like, this could maybe in 100 years this will be in a museum somewhere. That's how well designed it is, and that's all that is. That is imagination. That's the softer side of the brain, the softer side of the business. And I think that's exactly the problem that a lot of companies face when they're trying to break into this world. Is they have no brand name, so they have to market themselves at a much more discounted rate than their biggest competitors.
Mm-hmm.
But also, just so even here in this Samsung case, so Todd Pendleton, the CMO, on the first day when he walked in, he put a Nike shoe on his desk, and then he put a Reebok shoe on his desk. And this is what he told me. It actually wasn't in the book. I don't remember. Mm-hmm. But he asked his staffers, okay, so why does one shoe go for 2 to 3 times the price at your local shoe shop, whereas the other shoe is sold in the discount bargain,
yes,
the bargain basement, the bargain boxes where you just look through old shoes and get your cheap one at the local Walmart. Like, what is the difference here? And the answer that they converged on was that Nike had simply become this master of crafting these cultural moments, of getting into the imaginations and the psyches, kind of like almost like the feeling when you go see a really good movie, maybe like an Oscar-nominated film, and it's starting, and you're thinking like, this is going to be really good. They got rave reviews. It's almost like when you open a Nike box, with these new $200 shoes, you're looking at them, and I'm a tennis player. And I'll look at them and I'll be like, I can't wait to put these on, because like it's just going to bring my game up so much, and it's going to feel like I'm walking on air. And it's that imagination that they've done a good job sparking.
It's a halo effect. They've spent so much time cultivating it, and now they use that as their biggest competitive advantage.
Yeah, that is the advantage. It's that halo, that feeling that that you're really holding something special in your hands, and it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, it is. A lot of companies have tried and failed. Mm-hmm. And, if you try and fail this, if you're a company like Samsung, and just to give you an idea, so Samsung spent about the equivalent of the entire economy of Iceland on marketing. That's a lot of money to be. That's a lot of money. Yeah, to be able to craft this kind of cultural, marketing, this imaginative style. I mean, if you're a big company and you spend that money and it fails and you can't do it, that is an enormous loss on your budget. I mean, that's something that it's not just about having a lot of money, but it really has to be executed with the right people and the right timing, and kind of feeling the pulse of the society around you and what people are thinking, how they're feeling. I mean, there's just so much precision and so much planning and work that goes into making these campaigns a success that, I think that there's also a tendency to focus on the successes, but then, there's a tendency to kind of ignore the failures, as if, everybody who does this is, somehow successful just because they have the right thinking behind them. I mean, it is a lot more than that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because there have been many examples of mobile phone companies absolutely failing with marketing campaigns. I mean, we've seen how many have risen and disappeared. How many have tried to break into the American market, LG and so on. But nobody has really become the de facto standard bearer for being the competitor to Apple.
Yeah, nobody has really become the major standard bearer. I think that Samsung has probably come the closest.
Yeah.
Samsung is still seen as the number two dog. The number two. That's kind of like if you're not getting an iPhone, then you're probably getting a Samsung. But
Yes.
the reverse is not always true. And I think that Samsung has made enormous progress, but because of their own internal politics, and there was some very nasty internal
Yes.
fights going on that are all detailed in the book. And it ended up that Todd Pendleton and his team left. A lot of them were just exhausted and tired out because they were being punished and blamed for the success of this campaign. I mean, a lot of the people in the Korean headquarters were quite frankly jealous. They were angry that a small office could outdo them and could kind of show off and do a better job than the headquarters, which is the all-powerful entity at Samsung. So, another question that I think, any listener that were to be, trying to do this kind of thing would have to ask is my organization set up to succeed at this? A lot of organizations just have internal structures that don't really work well with, this kind of cultural branding. If you look at Apple, one of the reasons why Apple has been so good at this is because they're essentially, at least how I see them, is that they're essentially a design company. They're a design company before anything else. And the designers, even Steve Jobs, Johnny Ive, I mean, at the very top, they would be just micromanaging every pixel on the product that they're putting out. I mean, they really demanded complete perfection, and they demanded this consistency across all these different products. So, Apple is able to create something that really has that artwork-like feel to it, whereas, a company like Samsung or any other big IBM type, big technology giant, they would have a lot of trouble with that because there are so many different offices making so many things. And, like we said before, if the marketer does something wrong and loses a contract for the semiconductor office because their competitor is really angry about that, then, that's a problem. And maybe the organization just isn't really built to sustain this kind of campaign.
Yeah, that's a good point you make, because if you look at Samsung as an example, but you see this in many companies, right? If something is very successful, people get jealous because they're not getting the credit, it's not going to affect their bonuses, and it's not part of their empire. They're willing to kill it, even though in the long term everyone's going to suffer, but they are still willing to kill something that's very beneficial. And, this is why I wanted to bring up the story about marketing, because we can see how organizational politics, we always know it's there, but we don't see the impact. But this story about marketing makes it very clear. It's not enough to be successful. It's whether you have an organization that can sustain the success.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. And I think that when I was writing the book, that was really what came through for me too. When I was thinking about, how to structure this and how to tell the story, I kept seeing this problem at Samsung over and over again. Yeah. And it wasn't only in marketing, but it happens in a lot of different offices. And it's this problem of competing egos and, competing offices. And an organization this big is going to have a lot of rivalries, internal resentments going on, a lot of people competing for the attention of their CEO. And if one office is unusually successful, then, a few other offices might team up and try to whack them back in place, get back into the bureaucracy and be one of us again. And that's essentially what happened at Samsung. They even had a campaign for a while called One Samsung. It was an internal PR campaign, and they were trying to unify the company and try to kind of, trying to kind of clear out some of these errant, marketing programs and make the brand one again, one under a single headquarters.
Yeah, but I mean, you can see that in the way when you start the book, you talk about the problems with the battery. And the problems with the battery, to me, is a mirror image of the problems with the marketing campaign. Because in the marketing campaign, you had the head office being unhappy with the success of the Texas office for marketing. But with the problem with the battery, you had the rest of the company trying not to get involved with the problems with the batteries because they thought it wasn't their problem.
Yes. And so just to remind listeners, so this was from 2016 and 17 when Samsung released a new phone called the Galaxy Note 7. And I'm sure many people will remember that these phones were catching fire, and they were...
You cannot forget it.
Yeah. There was an airplane that was grounded, a Southwest Airlines flight, and it was about to take off, but then a phone caught fire, and it had to be grounded. But then not only that, so Samsung recalled these phones in September 2016 and then put out new replacement devices that turned out to be also dangerous with the same problems with its batteries, that they were combusting and they were dangerous. There was one man whose car was totaled. He was luckily not in the car, but it caught fire when it was on his dashboard, and the fire spread to the what's it called again? What's the really combustible part of a car again? It's the
tank, the gas tank.
There's the gas tank, but anyway, it spread to some other part that I forgot what it was. That's really highly combustible, and it basically blew up his car. It turned it into this twisted hunk of metal and steel. It looked like something, I don't know if you remember the movie like Terminator 2 or something, but it looked like that world, where all those cars and robots are all destroyed and stuff. And this was happening, and Samsung was quiet about the matter. I mean, they said that they were unable to confirm that this was a problem for a long time because they couldn't confirm that the phones were actually replacement devices. So they were
bad response. I mean, a bad
response. And this is going back to what you were just saying. This was one of the biggest PR disasters in recent business history, I'd say. And a lot of the disaster came from the fact that there were competing offices who wanted to push the blame on others. So it looked like this was a problem with the battery. And in the end, Samsung concluded that it was actually a problem with the battery itself. But then, there was this whole host of issues where, the phone people didn't really want to take the blame for it. The battery people didn't want to take the blame. The organization was frozen for a while. I mean, it couldn't really come out with a coherent response because everybody was pushing the buck to somebody else and saying internally, like, it must be, your batteries suck. It's your battery, that's a problem. And then, of course, the public relations people who are out there at the forefront, and, they have to be assuring the public that they're doing something. They have really nothing to say because there's like an internal lockdown in the organization, and they're hunkered down. They don't want to say anything. They don't want to, they don't want to admit anything that would get them in trouble. They don't want to lose their jobs. Don't want to lose their bonuses. So basically, it was a really strange situation where these phones were blowing up, but then Samsung was essentially saying, like, well, I guess it's not our problem. This is all your problem. And they just kind of push it on society at large and say, we make good phones, but, we're doubtful that you're telling the truth. We tell the truth and everybody else lies. That was sort of the message they were sending out.
I remember reading in the book one of the emails that the customer service department sent to someone.
Yeah.
And it was a very confusing email about they don't know what they can say because they don't know what phone he has. And until they know what phone he has, they cannot actually say anything. It was the most confusing customer email response I've ever seen. It was so funny.
Yes, yes. I got a kick out of that too. That was pretty hilarious. But that is that's one of the big risks of having this this corporate organizational structure with so many offices. These offices are they're not always cooperative. They're competing with each other for the the bonus or the raise, or they're competing to get promoted to the next CEO. And when disaster strikes, it's just like, well, push it on the other guy. Like, I'm not taking responsibility for this. So, I think that in any public relations campaign or crisis communications, it's very similar to the issues with marketing that we discussed. And, the question is, like, do I have an organization, that can take the shock or take the blow or kind of absorb what's happening around us and actually collaborate to give an answer to the public or to market something to the public.
Yeah, and when I was reading the book, one of the things you do very well is you show the central tension that faces Samsung. On the one hand, they like to be very hierarchical where everything comes from the top, but all the good things they need to be successful cannot come from the top. They've got to bring it in and create these offshoots in Texas and so on. But when those parts become too successful, they get the wrong kind of attention. And I was thinking to myself, you're almost articulating Samsung's biggest weakness if I was a competitor trying to take on Samsung. I would take them on in the parts where it's outside central control because they struggle to mobilize an effective response.
Yes. And I think this also goes back to the organizational culture and the structure that we were talking about. the problem with Samsung and a lot of big companies is that they're really headquarters centric.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever there's even a Korean saying, and it's that a nail that sticks out gets hammered in.
Yeah.
And this is how I think that most Korean businessmen and business workers think of business. They don't think in terms of I'm going to go out and do the very best thing I can and stand out. What they tend to think in these corporations is I'm going to stay hidden in the system, because standing out is just it's going to attract way too much attention to me, and there are going to be so many people vying to take me down a notch and put themselves above me. So a place like Samsung, it is one of the biggest dilemmas facing big businesses, that the stars don't always have room to be stars. They are going to run up into these rivalries. They're going to run up into this this anger and resentment from other people who've been working there all their lives. And this is the main weakness, as you say, that Samsung has. And internally they know about it, and they've been trying to reform it without a whole lot of luck.
Yes.
The problem is that Samsung is a traditional company with these old promises of lifelong employment and family as company, and we're all in this together. The problem is that the world has changed so much, and this model doesn't really work well in our modern economy. But then the problem is that Samsung, and not just Samsung, but many companies bring in they'll bring in somebody from HP or or Compaq or IBM or Apple or any other big company, make them a chief marketing officer, make them a vice president for software, and every time they do that, that's a threat to the lifelong employees, the Samsung men as they're called, because that means that the promotion that they've been expecting since they were 25 years old and joined is being cut off. Like, they're no longer going to be climbing through the ranks as the company promised them with this lifetime employment offer. That every outsider changes the culture, and whenever the culture changes, well, that's a threat to my job, because look at me, I've been here my whole life, and who are these outsiders to come in and tell me how to do my job? Like, that's a threat to my own ascension in this organization.
Yeah, who are these Americans to tell me how to market phones? Yeah, who are these Americans? But the book ends off with what I think is almost it alludes to something, but it doesn't. Maybe it's a follow-up book, I don't know. But Samsung is no longer the insurgent. They are now facing insurgents from China.
Yes.
Everything that they've done to Apple is going to be done to them.
Yes. Yes, you're right. And actually, I did want to write more about that, but I was butting up against the limit. We had a page limit, and I couldn't go too far over it. But that is the latest saga in this world of technology, especially in hardware manufacturing and hardware design. The latest saga is, we've spent the past 20, 30 years fighting Apple and Sony, or, fighting whoever. And now, like, the model that we've used, it's basically being copied and imitated. And now the Chinese are using it against us. And this applies to so many companies around the world. So, we've never really seen anything like China before. I mean, I've done a lot of studies of the history of Japan and Korea, Germany, these industrial success stories. But China, first of all, has strength in numbers. Unlike these other places, China is no longer just an export market. They have their own consumer base.
Domestic market. They have enough of a market to keep themselves going.
Yes, and not only that, but unlike previous business success stories, they're starting with massive amounts of private data on all their citizens. A technology, a software ecosystem that already works in tandem with each other, that's separate from Google, and because Google, exited a long time ago.
Yes.
They have their own internal system that already works. So, they don't have to necessarily export their way out of poverty anymore. They don't need to rely on Americans or Europeans to buy their products. So they can take a lot of shocks and blows. They're not that vulnerable, and basically what that means is that we're up against a behemoth. That companies like Samsung, I think that they're very vulnerable to just getting completely squashed. And the reason for this is because of hardware manufacturing and the way it works.
Yes.
So hardware manufacturing, we live in this age of the software ecosystem, and I think that Americans in particular forget what it's like to actually be making hardware, which is one of the original business models. You can make any hardware you want, but you only have a 6 month to a year, period where that hardware is still going to be viable on the market, and then suddenly it's obsolete and you have to discount it heavily. So you're constantly caught in this cycle to get at the next hardware, the next product, the next little incremental innovation, the next semiconductor, and all of this takes enormous, investments far, far ahead of time that might not even work out. They're very risky. The market fluctuates. But let's say you have a giant like China coming in, and China has its own national semiconductor plan, and the Chinese government gets together all the big semiconductor makers, and then they just flood the market with the new AI semiconductors that are going to be used by, I don't know, it might be a company like LG in the future, or Alibaba, some of these big Tencent. These are some major Chinese tech firms. If they were to flood the market with non-memory semiconductors, then a company like Samsung, or even maybe even another Japanese or American company, Intel, I mean, these guys will be in a lot of trouble, because there's simply no way that they can respond with an onslaught of their own. They don't have government support anymore. That tradition has been dying, and no matter what Samsung does, they can make the next semiconductor or make the next smartphone. But the fact of the matter is that even if the Chinese are behind them, like the Chinese are only going to be 6 months behind them, or 4 months, and they're going to be able to make it a lot cheaper. And they're going to be able to follow up on every Samsung product with something that's just as good or maybe even better at some point. So, yeah, it's I think the only saving grace right now for a lot of these companies is the U.S. sanctions that the Trump administration put on. I mean, that's really the only thing I think that's going to insulate American and Japanese and Korean companies from some kind of just Chinese hardware, just like some kind of unstoppable force.
But it's not going to be a barrier for long. It's a temporary barrier.
Yes, it's a temporary barrier, and I agree with you. I don't think it's going to last forever. I think that it's simply too hard to set up a barrier like that and to expect that it will continue on and on and on. But then the other thing, of course, is that you have to remember that a lot of Chinese technologies being developed now are also being developed for military applications. I mean, China is a military power, and once you have the military involved, that really speeds up the pace of innovation. The military has a lot of money. It's a national priority. It's it can unify a lot of these companies into these consortiums and tell them to make what is the latest technology that's needed for a laser guided missile. And then imagine if that is that's making its way into the civilian world in some other form. Like a year after it comes in for the military. So that's going to really just boost the pace of innovation in China, and a company like Samsung, Sony, maybe even Apple one day. I mean, a lot of these companies, they're going to have a lot of trouble, keeping their products safe from that kind of attack.
Well, I think that the strong companies will do well, but the locus of influence will shift east over time. It's inevitable.
It is.
As China wisely, and not just China, I mean, we're talking about Asia Pacific in general, wisely invests their capital and produces their own consumer classes who can feed a revenue for their businesses, it's inevitable they invest that, produce better products, and at some point, maybe we won't be buying Western products in certain categories because the Asian stuff is just so much more superior.
Yes. And I think that the area that we should all be looking at now is especially artificial intelligence and any kind of software-based kind of product. I think that smartphones are becoming more and more software-based, and they have for a while. But it really is becoming more about the thing on the screen instead of the hardware itself around there. And I think that China is different in that they've actually got that software base going. I mean, they have their own thing, and I think that's going to really make them even more of a power than Japan was before them. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people can remember the days when there was this, this Japanese menace coming in, and people were talking in America. They were talking about the second Pearl Harbor in the 1980s, and Japanese cars are putting us out of business, and all this kind of thing. That turned out to be all overstated because Japan was in the midst of a major bubble, and a lot of the Japanese investments coming into America and Europe were actually just the result of the overheating of their currency. There was a currency readjustment in the 80s. So structurally, Japan was not really in a position to, overtake anybody. I mean, they could certainly, supplant the market with their own products and, they could certainly make the Walkman really popular, but in the end, they just didn't really have the population or the size. I mean, they had an aging population. They didn't really have the structure in place that would sustain, some kind of major technological force in the world.
But
If you look at China, sorry, what was that?
what I'm saying is also the mentality, right? I mean, there are only two countries in the world that think they should run the world besides the United States. That's Russia and China.
Yes, yes.
It starts with what you believe, and I think only the Chinese and Russians actually believe they should run the world. Nobody else.
Yes, yes, and that's true. It is about the mindset, and Japan. I don't think Japan ever really wanted to run the world, and not only that, but the success of Japan's economy and its technology and industry in those Cold War years was partially the result of this U.S. and Allied defense umbrella. I mean, Japan did not have a standing military, didn't need to spend money on expenditures and all this kind of thing. And then also, the presence of bases had a big influence on the economy in the early days. So there was lots of contracting that taught. So Japanese companies were able, these new companies that weren't destroyed in the war, they were founded. So this is like Sony and the Honda. I mean, these were called the Keiretsu, and they were started after World War II. But they were essentially using military technologies from the war for civilian purposes. But it was really only with the presence of, so a lot of these military bases, these foreign military bases, ironically, that, had really high standards for, they had military grade standards for their contracts in Korea and Japan. And, this is what allowed companies in Japan and Korea. So also, like, for example, Hyundai, the car maker, they were making infrastructure and roads. And, to reach that level where you're working for the U.S. military, like, you really have to have a high standard of quality and durability and just you really have to have a world-class company that you're overseeing to get to that level. So China does not have any of that, and I think what's interesting about China is that its inventions have been through a mixture of, you could say, politely it's called technology transfer, so signing deals with foreign companies that say, according to this, you have to transfer your IP, intellectual property, if you want to work with us, and we're gonna get some control over it. But China has really done a good job of creating an indigenous, and it's like an indigenous market and ecosystem that really doesn't depend on foreigners or outsiders. They really can stand on their own. Whereas Japan, during those Cold War years, I mean, especially after World War II, Japan was in a famine. I mean, the U.S. had sadly used atomic weapons on Japan. I mean, it was destroyed, and it was not a country that simply could stand on its own. It needed massive amounts of foreign aid and defense expenditures and military bases and just things that could help it rebuild. And the same was true of Korea. That this was not a nation that had prospects on its own. South Korea. I mean, South Korea was not well off. North Korea was wealthier than South Korea back in the early days. It had been invaded already by North Korea. There were Chinese and Soviet interests that were hostile to South Korea. And this is another example of a nation that it needs that umbrella to build into this this major technological powerhouse. And that's what's so interesting about China, is that it's not that it's its own thing. And it stands on its own. And I think that the Chinese government thinks that it should have a big say over how the world is run. And that's what we're seeing right now, is that we're seeing the clash of the titans. We're seeing China, Russia, America, just kind of getting into this this new order where we're not totally sure how things are going to be sorted out in the end. The EU is starting to disintegrate. It's just not very clear, like who's going to be on whose side and who's going to be in whose sphere of influence. And it's almost like we're entering this new kind of great game where, I would if I were a marketer or maybe a strategy person, I would probably be more worried about the time that we live in for our bottom line for businesses than any other time in the past, 20 or 30 years, because I think that there's so much more uncertainty. And as we've seen also with coronavirus and, with some of the changes in sort of, how diseases spread and how business is done, how technology is created, and, concerns about how AI is being used to surveil people. I mean, I think that we're actually on the edge of kind of this brave new world, and we don't really know in terms of business, like which investments are going to pay off right now, or who's going to be controlling things 10 years down the road.
Yes, I mean, the way I look at it, and to put it in perspective, is as a capitalist nation, China is still a baby.
Yes.
And we don't know what this baby is going to grow into. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. We just don't know who is going to be the Samsung of China. And to think about is, in the West, we don't even know the most popular singer in the world because that person is probably in China and we've never heard of them.
Yes.
So everything we know is just of our world, but there's a whole world that's walled off and we don't know what's going to happen as those companies start moving across the world.
Yes, I agree. And we really don't know. I don't think anybody knows. And I think anybody who claims to know, they're ultimately relying on conjecture and hypothetical guessing. I think that, I think that, let's say, if we were to go back to let's say we went back to the release of the iPhone in 2007, people back then were mocking the iPhone. I mean, Microsoft made fun of it.
BlackBerry made fun of it. I remember that.
Yeah. BlackBerry made fun of it, even though they were about to collapse. They didn't realize that. Samsung employees made fun of it. LG made fun of it. Sony made fun of it. I mean, everybody was basically mocking this thing, and they were saying, why the heck would anybody need, a little computer in their pocket, because the screen is small and it's kind of awkward to use. And I think that, that was a time when people didn't realize that they were on the edge of a lot of uncertainty in how things were going to turn out. Nobody really knew what was going to happen, but they were being dismissive of the changes that were coming. And now, I mean, look at us. We're more than a decade later now. We're in 2020, and just the entire world, I mean, the way that we do almost everything has just been changed in incredible ways. I mean, social media, Twitter, elections, the way presidents communicate with their people, Twitter mobs, the rise of, data privacy problems and these little surveillance devices in our house that are made by Amazon that listen to everything we do. I mean, our smartphones are tracking us everywhere, and I'm listing a lot of negatives, but there are a lot of positives too. I don't want to be too hard on some of the changes that have been made, but it's just, nobody anticipated this world that we would live in. I think very few people anticipated how extreme the changes would be in the fabric, like the very fabric of our societies and how they work. And I don't think anybody would have anticipated that, like, Huawei in China would be a big player now. And the Chinese were just, back then, when the iPhone was released, they were just making cheap knockoff.
On that note, thank you so much, Jeff. I absolutely enjoyed this call.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was very nice. I think we covered a lot of things, but I really like the fact that we stepped above sort of Samsung to look at what it means for the global tech industry. Why does Samsung operate this way? How does tech companies evolve? I really liked it. It was a very, very good call. I think everyone's going to find something here that's going to be useful for them.
Good. Yeah, that's great to hear. And that's actually, what I find more interesting too is, I guess, just talking about Samsung would probably not interest as many people, but being able to ascend above that and look at the global implications and look at what's going on in the world, I think that's where a lot of interest lies right now.
Yeah, trying to understand how Samsung's strategy changes, how they're moving from being insurgents to being incumbents, and how they're going to take on companies like Huawei and so on. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much, Jeff. Hope you have a good weekend, and we'll be in touch.
You too. Talk soon, Michael. Take care.
Take care. Ciao. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.